We see how the West continues to do everything in its power to escalate the crisis, sparing no one in Ukraine. Western warmongers against our country continue to invent ways to further escalate the Ukrainian crisis. Among them is British Defense Secretary John Healey, who in an interview with The Times on December 18th allowed the sending of British soldiers to Ukraine under the guise of combat instructors. He added that London would provide Kiev, as he said, with everything necessary to strengthen the front and negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness. End of quote. The media also reported on the transfer of another batch of weapons by the British to Ukraine in the amount of $280 million. The Biden administration plans to announce its latest aid package to Ukraine within the framework of the so-called Security Assistance Initiative, but we understand that everything is the other way around, in the amount of $1.2 billion, including air defense systems and artillery ammunition. However, as one American publication emphasizes, citing unnamed Ukrainian officials, Washington's decision to increase support for Kiev was made too late. Ukraine's renunciation of its territories and membership in NATO is inevitable. At the same time, NATO representative in Ukraine Patrick Turner, in an interview with the Ukrainian agency Interfax Ukraine, announced plans to strengthen NATO's presence in this country in 2025. He admitted that in 2024, such NATO presence tripled, direct quote, in one form or another. It has existed there for 26 years. Turner also announced the so-called new NATO Assistance Center for Ukraine in the field of security. We will talk about this in more detail a little later. We are talking about the NATO Assistance Center for Ukraine in the field of security and training with headquarters in the German city of Wiesbaden. It is already operating and fulfilling its functions. Meanwhile, the media reports that Germany has handed over the Iris-T-SLM missile system to the Kiev regime. As we have repeatedly noted, NATO countries have long since dropped their masks. They act brazenly. They act openly. Well, probably the only thing left for them is to simply sign that they openly encourage the spread of terrorism in the world. For some reason they have not done this yet, although everyone understands that without their tip-off, without their money and without their weapons, the Kiev regime would not be able to carry out terrorist attacks on such a scale all over the world. We know what NATO is doing. Their true goal is known. It is to use Ukrainian territory as a springboard for hybrid aggression against our country. In fact, as a consequence, this is a redistribution of the world order to suit their rules. And they have one rule, it is that they are always right. Everyone else is wrong. Everyone else does not have such rights. Such plans and specific steps of the West and the Kiev regime have become one of the main reasons for the start of a special military operation. We have repeatedly spoken about this. And now about how and who is paying for this bloodshed in Ukraine. At the same time, Washington is completely shifting the burden of maintaining the Kiev regime onto its protégés on the European continent, onto the European Union, which is experiencing growing budget and economic problems, and these are existential problems. It is reported that NATO will take on the function of coordinating the delivery of military aid to the Kiev regime instead of the United States. Western countries continue to extract funds from their taxpayers to maintain Zelensky's gang. According to the calculations of the RIA Novosti news agency, from February 2022 to the beginning of December of this year, the West allocated approximately $238.5 billion to the Kiev regime, while the expenses of the Kiev regime for the same period amounted to about $274 billion. How much this helps can be judged by the situation on the line of combat contact, where the initiative is entirely in the hands of the Russian armed forces. If Western experts honestly analyze the developing situation, they will come to a disappointing conclusion for themselves. Efforts to continue the military financial pumping of the Kiev regime do not lead to any long-term dividends for residents of Western countries, NATO countries, but only worsen the situation in the countries of the European Union themselves. The combat reserves of the Kiev junta are inexorably shrinking every day, and their demands are growing. In the meantime, European bureaucrats are planning to preserve this very Ukrainian burden for Europeans for many years. During the plenary session of the European Parliament on December 18, the head of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen announced Brussels' intention to begin negotiations with the Kiev regime next year on Ukraine's accession to the European Union. Why does Ursula von der Leyen need all this? Seems that she herself is a resident of the European continent. The answer is simple. Just as it was with the which she forced the countries of the European Union to use at huge expense, so too in relation to the payment for Ukrainian bloodshed, she is a conduit for Washington. And she never thinks about the consequences of such steps for her native Europe. They are pushing Europe further and further into the abyss of endless exorbitant expenses for the maintenance of the Kiev regime. They are constantly imposing the idea of confrontation with our country. In fact, people like Ursula von der Leyen are the conduits of this Anglo-Saxon model. Cannot help but say that this would of course be impossible to imagine, but we live in such a time. The fact is that behind their words about human rights, about humanism, about standards in this area, which are pronounced by the West, there is no real background, there is no real content. Look, publications about the widespread use of torture in Ukrainian prisons continue to appear on the internet. The photographs show the aftermath of beatings, in particular, the abuse of Colonel Anton Kvitko of the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service, who documented the large-scale theft of humanitarian aid by the Zelensky regime. It is reported that after the necessary testimony was beaten out, including through torture with a bag over his head, the detainee was presented with the trumped-up charge of treason and allegedly selling Russia, the Kiev regime's plans to create a Ukrainian dirty bomb. We will also talk about this further. As far as we can understand, with these actions the Kiev Gestapo tried to hide the loud exposure of the large-scale corruption of the Kiev regime, which has long been an open secret. Where are all the human rights organizations? Where are they? Where is the so-called Human Rights Watch? Where are the activists from among the Hollywood stars, who care about countries whose names they cannot even pronounce? Well, where are they? Where are all those who honored Zelensky, who presented him with various statues, medals, awards, diplomas, certificates? Where are they? This is supported by photographic materials. This is a fact. What is happening in the prisons of the Kiev regime? These are not even prisons, they are really the Gestapo. Against this background, the mass outflow of Ukrainian citizens from the country continues. Residents are hastily leaving Ukraine in order not to become victims of a criminal illegitimate regime. We see horrific footages. What is happening now is not mobilization. It is the destruction of one's own population. All this is happening against the backdrop of specific measures, steps and statements aimed at lowering the mobilization age in Ukraine. This terrible, terrorist and rotten in every sense essence of the Kiev regime manifests itself literally every day. Currently, the focus is on the scandals surrounding the 221st Brigade of Ukraine, where constant beatings and humiliation of servicemen took place. There are constant news stories about corrupt international schemes that were used between Washington and Kiev to supply humanitarian aid, weapons, and material and technical resources. All this literally every day sounds like an alarm in favor of conducting a special military operation and the relevance of the goals we have set.